Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I want to talk about some events that took place recently in Australia and New Zealand and the broader context in which they took place. So uh, this month, some women organized several events in Australia and New Zealand under the banner Let Women Speak. And the main message of these events and others elsewhere in the world, such as in the UK, US, and Canada, uh, is simple. Women and girls, females, should, for the sake of their safety and privacy, have female only spaces. In other words, women's locker rooms, prisons, bathrooms, rape and domestic violence shelters, and sports should be exclusively for females, and males should not be allowed in them, irrespective of whether they identify as women. And the other message of these women and their allies is that so called gender affirming care, where individuals with gender dysphoria, meaning people who are unhappy with their male or female bodies and believe that they quote unquote should have been the other sex, that they were born in the wrong body, are given testosterone if they are females, or estrogen if they're males, and perhaps puberty blocking drugs prior to that if they're pre-pubertal at the time, perhaps surgically offered so as to have an appearance more like the opposite sex. That these medical procedures are harmful, resulting in sterility, loss of sexual functioning, and various other health damaging consequences. And this so-called gender affirming care doesn't necessarily alleviate their psychological issues. And some other time we can talk about that. As a psychologist who has gotten lots of clinical training, I certainly have some things to say about this issue. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus strictly on the first of these messages in this talk. So, it ought to be a no-brainer that there are good reasons why members of each sex, especially women, prefer to have single-sex spaces available to them. And there are nude beaches, but those are fully public spaces where people of both sexes are there and naked by choice. They weren't forced to go there. Whereas, if you go to a gym and you want to take a shower or fully change clothes, get out of your sweaty clothes after your workout or whatever, for as long as I can remember, locker rooms or changing rooms, whatever you want to call them, have been single-sex spaces. People who want to change and shower there have to be naked in front of other people. And, a sizable minority of people aren't even comfortable being naked in front of strangers of their own sex, let alone members of the opposite sex. Now, I looked, but I wasn't able to find a poll specifically looking at a representative sample of people's opinions about single-sex locker rooms. But I did find a recent poll that found that 96% of women in the UK oppose getting rid of single-sex public restrooms. So I would imagine the figure is even higher, although it couldn't get much higher, regarding facilities where you actually have to get naked in front of strangers. The percentage is even higher of people wanting those spaces to remain single-sex. Now, let's have a look here at where is it? This survey reported in a Daily Mail. Just 4% of women in the UK support making all toilets gender neutral. Fewer than 1 in 20 women support the replacement of men's and women's loos, as they say in the UK, with gender-neutral ones, a poll reveals. Just 4% would be happy if restaurants, hotels, bars, theaters, Cinemas, concert venues, and stadiums abolish separate toilets for two sexes. Men are almost as unenthusiastic. Fewer than 1 in 10 support the loss of their own loos in public spaces. But a third of those questioned said they did support having gender neutral toilets alongside those for men and women. And similarly, another opinion poll, a random sample of people, found that when people were asked if they would personally feel comfortable or uncomfortable using a unisex toilet in a public place, the plurality or majority of women said they would not be comfortable. 56% of British women versus 38% saying they were comfortable. 47% of American women and 46% of French women. For men, the figures, as you can see there, were pretty much the opposite. But, as the other poll said, most men still favored the existence of single-sex restrooms for both males and females. So, just so you have an accurate picture of where the women speaking at these demonstrations are coming from, let me show you a speech by one of them at the Let Women Speak event in Melbourne.
You're next. Against it. Thank you so much. It's just so many women want to speak. Those people over there, the police are facing you because you're the bloody bad guys.
I've condensed it. I said basically in the beginning that I was raised on the tolerant left. I used to be an ally. So like most, when COVID hit, I ended up chronically online. It was during that time that I finally saw just how deranged the left had become. That there was no way around it. My tolerant left had gone and lost its fucking mind. Trading intolerance chips for totalitarianism. For some shut up, get on your knees and comply. Misogyny, that slimy hand around women's throats that I saw as a child. Misogyny had had a revamp. It was glamorous now, all sparkly. It had some flags and new allies. Violent beta males wearing hankies on their faces, giving a wink and a nod to their comrades while screaming down women who just don't fancy having girl dick shoved in their daughters' faces in the change rooms at the pool. Their green-haired 20-something female conspirators feeling righteous while shielding trans-identified men who'd raped little girls and then had their chance with female inmates while imprisoned with them against their will. Freshly anointed trans women athletes mopping the tracks and stalls of the blood, sweat and tears of female athletes who they'd beaten, those tirelessly dedicated women from whom they'd stole. Women were just a feeling. We weren't mothers anymore, we were birthers. I hadn't breastfed for 3 long fucking years. Sore and overtouched breasts, loving the dazed and tired from sleepless nights. I chest-fed for inclusion. Our lesbian and gay friends weren't allowed same-sex attraction. Their orientation was just a genital preference for backwards boomers, too vanilla and hate-filled to enjoy someone's vagina without wincing or take that organic strap because it's real and so it's better, ladies. Now suck it. Pedophiles had had a rebrand too. Minor attracted people they were, stunning and brave and here to stay. And if we made a peep about it, we were alt-right fascists. Or the slightly lesser charge, alt-right fascist adjacent, because apparently safeguarding children is violent. Protecting their little bodies is far right. I used to be an ally, but now after having my compassion as a woman weaponized against me, being abused by filthy misogynists and their tragic brainwashed handmaidens, watching our lesbian sisters have to fight again for men to get the fuck out of their bedrooms and social spaces. Reading of countless women and children getting raped and discarded by decrepit autogynephiles, wearing woman face like it's our skin, and watching all of those trans folks and trans allies kick back and just deny, denouncing detransitioners like they were the new suppressive persons and thus all but the scum of the earth. Yet not a word about the sick and twisted men claiming womanhood who are harming us, representing them in their name, no less. And not a side glance, of course, at all the trans-identified women and girls, forcing nothing, forcing no one save for the muscle and sinew to be cut from their bodies for the sake of simulacrum. It's funny that. I'll politely state for the record it's my preference not to be called a cis woman. I don't qualify my existence in relation to another's. Which is especially the case for narcissistic Trojan horses. I will be referred to as a woman, as a female, as a feminist, and not their brand of feminist, but my own. Because women far stronger than us fought long and hard for us to be standing here, and there isn't a misogynist alive who has the chops to change my mind. But they'll call me a TERF regardless, and I'm at the point where I just don't fucking care. Your ad hominems, they're no good here. You can't cash in that guilt by association. Your redirections, projections, smear campaigns, mistruths, and flying monkeys they all alter course and land squarely back on you, because reality defines who I am, who we are. I exclude no females from that shared reality, not one. All are welcome here, and welcome to return, even those handmaidens, especially the handmaidens, because they won't always be safe from those pitchforks that they're wielding. They're not men, so they're disposable. And if they speak out in turn, then they'll get turned on too. We've been through worse, and we've survived because we're women. We're built different. We're observed, not assigned. And nothing enrages a misogynist more than a woman saying no while insisting that she knows her own mind.
Okay, so yeah, I think most people would react positively to and agree with the vast majority of what she said, as I did. But even if you don't, I mean, regardless of that, first of all, the treatment of women in most societies, including Western societies, continues to be a huge problem. As I've discussed before, about a third of women in the U.S., including my partner and many friends, have been sexually assaulted. And similar figures hold in other Western countries, such as Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand actually has the highest rate of domestic violence among all OECD countries, the wealthier countries in the world. And tend to keep good figures about this sort of thing. And it won't do to pretend that we don't live in a rape culture, a culture where there's still a lot of misogyny and women can't count on being safe in either public or private spaces. What could better illustrate that than the fact that both presidential candidates here in the United States, where I live, both major party presidential candidates, had multiple accusations against them by women that they had sexually assaulted them. You can't get more, and these complaints were bandied about for political purposes by the opposing political party, but ignored by the candidate's own political parties. And in fact, the women who accused Joe Biden of various sorts of sexual misconduct were smeared. They were personally attacked, and disbelieved. So, our culture is one where women can't count on being safe in either public or private spaces. Now, as those of you who watch this channel know, I've taught a lot with someone who's lived in China for a long time, and I've talked with other people who live in China. And from what I understand from people who live there, women feel perfectly safe being out in public alone there. There's very little violence against either women or men there. But we don't live in such a society. You're not in the United States, not in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, obviously, many Middle Eastern countries, Europe, you name it. And women and children need protection from those who would do them harm. Now, you don't have to agree with all or most of what that speaker who I just showed you the speech from to think that, hopefully, she has a right to say what she said. That, she should be able to say it and not be shouted down or called names or threatened or even physically attacked. But what has the response actually been to women at these sorts of events taken to the public square to voice such opinions? As the moniker of these events, hashtag Let Women Speak, suggests, although certainly some of the majority who I just mentioned, who support single-sex spaces for women as well as for men, some of them do show up in support or speak. A large contingent of mostly male people shows up at these events to try to prevent women from speaking. Shouting them down, calling them names such as TERF or transphobe or even Nazi, just like back in my youth, right-wingers called feminists, feminazis. Those of you who are a bit older may remember that. Threatening them, there were multiple rape and death threats against the women who spoke at these rallies, and that happens a lot to women who are outspoken. And there were also even physical attacks on them. At the event in Melbourne that this speech is from, for example, several women were assaulted. Many more were threatened. One woman was knocked unconscious and had to be hospitalized with a concussion. And the men in the audience who weren't supporting the women, who call themselves trans rights activists, even punched police horses in the gut to try and break through the police lines and get at the women speaking or the people listening. So, no respect there for either women or animals, or at least for women who don't share their opinions. In addition to that, out of the blue at the event in Melbourne, a group of black-clad men showed up at the event, dressed in black like most of the men who were there protesting the event, the people who say they're trans rights activists. And unlike the, I'll just call them TRAs for short, who were kept behind the police lines because they had lots of signs threatening the women, and they were very boisterous, yelling and shouting and insulting the speakers. They were kept behind police lines. But this particular group of men were allowed by the police to, even though they were dressed much like many of the other men there, so the police must have known who they were. But they were allowed by the police to enter the event space, and then they proceeded to do a Nazi salute. So they were a bunch of Nazis, about 20 Nazis, and then they were ushered out by the police. And I already mentioned that several women attending or speaking at the rally were assaulted by the TRAs, but the Nazis were not, interestingly enough. And yet, critics of Kellie J. Keane, the person who has been the impetus for the organization of these Let Women Speak events, and the other women speaking, including top Australian politicians and some mass media outlets, smeared these women as quote-unquote Nazis because a group of Nazis, uninvited, crashed their event. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, so one of the attendees at the protest was a member of Parliament there in the Melbourne area named Moira Deeming. She's a member of the Liberal Party, or she was until she was suspended for attending this event. And so she sent out a written message and basically gave a speech along the same lines in her defense when expulsion of her from the Liberal Party, the Australian Liberal Party, which is kind of a center-right party, were trying to expel her from the party. So let me just go through this with you. It provides a pretty good summary of events that took place at the protests, as well as all the machinations in the Parliament of the state of Victoria. The Liberal Party's contingent in that party, in an effort to expel her from the party. So she says the proposed motion provided to me makes allegations about alleged conduct by me said to have occurred on Sunday, 19th of March, 2023, and the days preceding. To the extent that the proponents seek to refer to and rely upon events that occurred on Saturday, 18th of March, 2023, at Parliament House, the notice is defective. The proponents of the motion do not establish a purported basis to expel me from the Victorian Liberal Party. The allegations about Ms. Keane, the Let Women Speak Melbourne event, and Ms. Angie Jones, one of the other speakers, are false and deliberately and selectively misleading. On 18th of March, 2023, I attended and participated in an event held on the steps of Parliament House entitled Let Women Speak, which was hosted by Ms. Keane. This was disclosed in advance, as I mentioned in Parliament. I admit that with the benefit of hindsight of what has occurred, that my participation may have been an error of judgment that resulted in unneeded scrutiny. When I attended the event, I made sure I did not speak as a liberal. In fact, I did not even mention I was a member of the Liberal Party. My contribution was to read a letter from a Muslim friend and constituent who shared her concerns about the loss of sex-based rights from an immigrant Muslim perspective. And as you may know, it's sort of standard practice within most Muslim adherents to deem single-sex spaces to be very important. I've actually been to a mosque before, and for a lot of the time that I was there, the males and the females were in separate spaces. Northern Territory Country Liberal Party Senator Jacinta Price addressed the same event. In Queensland, Tasmanian Liberal Party Senator Claire Chandler had planned to attend the event in Canberra. This event tour was supported by CPAC, a known and reputable organization which is chaired by Warren Mundine AO, former Australian Labor Party national president, who sought office both as a Labor Party and Liberal Party candidate. Ms. Keane was interviewed by Sky News, 2GB, and other news outlets in advance of this event. This event and the positions discussed at the event represent positions in the Australian mainstream and are reflective of a broad spectrum of the constituency of this state, and some of the concerns raised have been vindicated by the decision of the World Athletics Council on 24th March 2023. She's referring there to the decision by that body to require that women's events in whatever athletic events they are responsible for overseeing be for females only, rather than allowing transgender women or trans-identified males or whatever you want to call them to participate. I was known to the organizers, and they asked if I could assist in making the event safer. I sought permission from Parliamentary Services in advance for them to be granted access to the secured car park to avoid traveling through the blockade of far left-wing extremists. I don't really agree with her characterization of the activists there. I don't think there's anything left-wing about harassing women. B. False allegations. Ms. Keene. The false accusation that Ms. Keene was known to be publicly associated with far right-wing extremist groups, including neo-Nazi activists, perpetuated by far left-wing activists, if it had any credibility, would have resulted in her being denied entry to Australia and New Zealand. Because there was, when Kelly J. Keene was traveling from Australia to New Zealand for the event there, New Zealand sort of balked at first about admitting her into the country based on these sorts of allegations. But as Ms. Deeming goes on to say here, Ms. Keene was investigated and no such basis to revoke her visa was found. Ms. Keene did do an interview with Jean-Francois Garapi. I'm not sure who that is, but Ms. Keene has previously addressed this, stating she had no knowledge of his beliefs, and if she was aware, she would have challenged his beliefs directly or not appeared. And this is a common tactic that we see here in the United States, where if anyone goes on to Tucker Carlson's show for an interview, for example, because they can't get on any other mainstream news show in the United States, they're smeared as being somehow right-wing or having the same politics as Tucker Carlson, even though, when they go on that show, they put forth a very progressive sort of view, such as critiquing U.S. foreign policy or things, advocating for freedom for Julian Assange or things of that nature. The Pink News article referred to and annexed to this motion, also including the following from Ms. Keene. She told Pink News that she was asked to go on the show by, let's see, do I want to read all this? White supremacy and the racism that fuels it has no place in a civilized society. I abhor those views and the people that follow them, or that hold them. As a free speech advocate, I think dialogue, even with those with the most odious prejudices, is essential. How are we ever to change or challenge them if we don't engage? These days, so many people are called Nazis and far right that the prophetic warning that we will no longer recognize the real ones is beginning to come true. Let's see. Okay, and so she goes on to rebut several other allegations against Kelly J. Keene. Let's see. As to the reliance on the actions of the National Socialist Network on 18th March 2023, and that's the name of the group of neo-Nazis that briefly made an appearance within the event space after being let in by the police. And by the way, one of the leaders of that group is the son of a Melbourne police officer. Ms. Keene and Ms. Angie Jones have declared multiple times that... she says these persons were not associated with the Let Women Speak event. Ms. Keene and Ms. Angie Jones have declared multiple times that these men were not associated with their event. And she gives several links here. The Australian Julius Association has also declared that these were not associated groups. The allegations about my meeting with Ms. Keene, Catherine Dabbs, and Angie Jones after the Let Women Speak event on 18th March 2023 are misleading. We met at my urging, as recorded on the video, so we could address the invasion of the event. As recorded in the video, we started explaining that at the start we did not know who they were. They were thought to be Antifa, anti-fascists, who wear all black and cover their faces, which is exactly what the neo-Nazis did. Antifa have tried to attack similar events overseas. I mentioned we had a volunteer who tried to stop them coming into our area, and the police seemed to usher them onto the steps and then past our event. And then she quotes from some of the women in this conversation, or all the women from this conversation that she was referring to. 1218, they did a Nazi salute, and that was horrifying. Deeming. All of us women were terrified. Deeming. There were these terrifying, big, strong, masked men, and we didn't know why they were there. And we know now that the police knew that they weren't with us because they escorted them away from us and away from the protests. Deeming. Kelly Jane Keene said, our own marshals had asked them to leave. I wonder what prompted them to leave because I didn't really notice them. And Angie Jones said, they didn't come near us. We all had our backs to them. Okay, here's the statement from the Australian Jewish Association that she mentioned. Australian Jewish Association condemns the Nazis and defends Let Women Speak organizers who had nothing to do with them. Let's see. In the interest of time, maybe I won't read through all of this, but basically, as it's it's just a statement by this organization that this was a smear tactic against the women speaking, and they had nothing to do with the Nazis. And here's a quote from one of the people in this Nazi group. He says, both the groomer ideology of, quote, trans activists and the lesbianism promoted by Kelly Jane Keene Minshall are forms of liberalism directed by the global homo regime at white people in order to undermine white families, birth rates, and social cohesion. So it doesn't sound like they support either of these groups, right? Oh, sorry, I didn't show you that. That's okay. I read it to you. So let's talk about some of the things that happened at these events. In terms of threats and violence from the TRAs. Let's see. I mentioned that one of the women there was actually shoved down and knocked unconscious and suffered a concussion. She was, I assume, one of the speakers at the event. There was another woman speaking, and suddenly a TRA who had infiltrated the event space, posing as one of the supporters, rushed the stage and shoved the woman who was speaking at the time, grabbed the mic from her and started speaking. And this, by the way, was a trans-identified male, or trans woman if you prefer. So this woman gets shoved aside, and another woman was shoved down by this person and hit her head on the concrete and suffered a concussion and was knocked out. There was another incident, one of several, where a woman was left disabled following an attack by a trans activist here at this protest in Melbourne. She and her partner were attending a nearby punk rock event, and then they just stopped outside the event they had been attending for a group photo, and she and a friend were just walking around talking. They weren't even at the protest; they were just near it. I noticed one male walking beside the group, but in the opposite direction to the rest of us. As he passed me, he shoulder barged me hard, and I stopped to address him. Ruby described her attacker as male but not obviously trans. As she was with a group of individuals belonging to the punk rock community, she didn't immediately believe he was attempting to present as the opposite sex, and simply thought he was donning classic punk attire. Startled by the body check, Ruby confronted the male. I said something like, "Is there a problem here? Do you and I need to have a conversation?" He started denying and gaslighting. He claimed it was an accident, and one of his friends backed him up. It was clearly no accident, so I replied, "No, he just shoulder barged me as hard as he could." Ruby said the onlookers immediately seemed to take issue with the pronoun she had used for the man. I heard a few murmurs of he, like people were offended at my choice of pronoun, she says. I stood facing him for another few seconds, waiting to see if he was going to kick off, but he seemed to have nothing to say, so I turned and walked away. But just as she did, Ruby says she was suddenly attacked from behind, with the man pushing her onto the concrete with tremendous force. I put my left arm out to break the fall, she said, with anything other than my head, and the impact reverberated all up my arm, shattering my shoulder and breaking my arm at the joint. Ruby says other pub crawl goers, attendees at the party, told the man to back off, and she says that while she was in extreme pain, she didn't immediately recognize the extent of the damage. So anyway, she was so disabled by this attack, which, as I mentioned, broke her arm and wrecked her shoulder joint. She's now unable, and the doctors say permanently unable, to raise her arm higher than her shoulder. And apparently, what happened was that this person was a TRA person who saw a Facebook post that she made about women's rights in spaces, such as that males, even if they identify as female, shouldn't be put in women's prisons, and he was very offended by this, and so that was the cause of the person's angry attack. Now, irrespective of what you think of the point of view of this woman or others who adopt a so-called gender-critical perspective, where they say, basically, female-only spaces are important. People should stay away from opposite-sex hormones and surgery, mastectomies and so forth, because they're harmful and physically harmful, cause you to become sterile, cause various other health problems, and are not really, generally speaking, an effective treatment for any underlying dysphoria about being a sex other than what the person would like to be. Regardless of whether you agree with that perspective or not, do you think it's okay for people like this woman to be assaulted by somebody who disagrees with them? I would hope not. And there were several other incidents like this that occurred at the protests. There's all this talk in the media of these women supposedly being Nazis because supposedly the men doing their Nazi salute were affiliated with them in some way, which is just a lie. And so these lies were bandied about in the both the Australian and New Zealand mainstream media with hardly any critical thinking about whether it was true that a group of women advocating for typical feminist messages, such as women ought to be able to have domestic violence and rape shelters where you know, males of any sort, regardless of how they identify, shouldn't be allowed in, for their safety and privacy and dignity. Um, you know, that they would have something to do with Nazis who are not noted for their support for women's rights is, to say the least, a bit far-fetched. Nonetheless, this claim was uncritically repeated in the media in both Australia and New Zealand, with the result that the crowd got a lot more hostile even than they were in Melbourne, which they were very hostile there. At the next couple of events, the police didn't make as much of an effort to protect the women, and things were even worse in New Zealand. So let me just read to you a short article by Kelly J. Keane, who goes by the pen name Posey Parker sometimes, titled Fear and Loathing in New Zealand, where she outlines some of what happened in Australia and then what that then led up to in New Zealand, which she visited next. She's speaking here of events in Auckland, New Zealand, where a Let Women Speak event was scheduled shortly after the last Australian event. The mob lunged towards me, screeching and grabbing, and I knew that if I fell, I would never get up. I've stopped expecting mercy from anyone whose motto is be kind, but the event last week was terrifying. This was, a week ago today that this happened. I was sure in that moment on the New Zealand leg of my Let Women Speak tour that the trans activists who surrounded me would trample me to death if they could. They gather in menacing groups to intimidate us and hurt us if they can, just to prevent us speaking a simple truth. That women don't have penises, men don't have vaginas, there's no such thing as non-binary, and transitioning children is abuse. And corollary to that women should, and girls should have single-sex spaces. We started these talks at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, London, and have now taken them around the UK and across the USA. The format of the event is a gathering with a microphone and amplification, live streamed to my Kelly J. Keane YouTube channel. Women can say what they want, protected by the group. It's a genuine free speech event. Sydney, Brisbane, and Perth events saw a few hundred women in total attend and speak about the impact transgender ideology is having upon their lives. They were afraid and yet defiant. They've had enough. There were tears and a triumphant resolve to bring our society back to a place where the truth has more value than virtue signaling. The turn towards violence came in Melbourne at our largest gathering. The police had done a pretty fine job of protecting women with buffer zones between us and the rabid trans activists. But this gathering included competing groups of women-hating losers, trans incels to the left of me and Nazis to the right. And here we were, stuck in the middle and blamed by the media and politicians for the Nazi salute that occurred. I've been asked following that incident whether I have sympathies with the far right, but seriously, who does? It's a vile ideology, and frankly, anyone convinced by it in 2023 is pathetic. John Pesutto, the leader of the Liberals in Victoria, repeated dangerous lies about me and suspended Maura Deeming MP from his party for her association with me. Victoria's a state in Australia. The Tasmanian event was pretty horrifying. The women who spoke were visibly terrified, and an angry mob drowned out their voices with hysterical screams and cult-like mantras. Following the event, I was called a turd, a play on turf. By the way, turf is an insult often hurled at gender-critical women, women who critique this ideology that stands for trans-exclusive radical feminists. In other words, feminists who think that trans women or trans-identified men should be excluded from female-only spaces because they're female-only, and it's valuable for women to have them. It's a bit of a misnomer because nobody's trying to exclude trans-identified females from female-only spaces, because they are female. In any case, following the event, I was called a turd, a play on turf, in the Tasmanian Parliament. The storm gathered pace, and in New Zealand it was magnified 100-fold. There was a case brought to the High Court to try to stop me entering the country, and their media started a constant spew of lies, insisting that I was a dangerous anti-trans Nazi. At the border, I had a 2-hour interrogation and search. The hotel that she was scheduled to stay at in Wellington canceled her reservation. And in the hotel that she did stay at in Auckland, where the first Let Women Speak event in New Zealand was scheduled, a threatening note was slid under my door while I slept. So they described what she was wearing. We know where you are, and we're gonna. I don't recall exactly what it said, but it threatened violence against her. I had been told I would be protected by the police. That couldn't have been farther from the truth. The big event, the one that had been in the news, was in Auckland, and the minute I arrived, I felt rising fear. As the car pulled up, I could see the thousands gathered to oppose me. My security gathered around me, and we pushed through the hateful mob to the center, where the local organizers and attendees were who had come to speak. Where were the police? Not one officer was in that crowd. Not one officer was there to protect the brave women who turned up. There were maybe a dozen or so police on the outskirts of the protests, but unlike in Melbourne, they never came into the protest space to try and keep the speakers and attendees and counter-protesters separated from each other. Where were the police? Not one officer was in that crowd. Not one officer was there to protect the brave women who turned up. Within seconds, a man had tipped tomato soup all over my head. Again, as in Melbourne, somebody had infiltrated the crowd there to hear the women speak, and then rushed the stage and poured tomato soup on Kelly J. Keene's head, as soon as she got there. I continued to live stream, but over the next few minutes, the mob took on a life of its own. A frenzy grew until it was a deafening swell, a modern-day burn the witch. Men started ripping down the barriers and charging forward. "The police aren't coming," said my head of security. "We have to get you out." This meant placing me in the center of my security and some stewards, women who had volunteered to help, pushing through the baying mob. As we moved, we stumbled. I knew that a body on a floor is fair game and ripe for stomping and kicking. When we eventually got to the outer edge of the park, the police did step in and help me get to a car. They took me to the nearest police station, where I was guarded for 6 hours before I had an escort of 3 police officers to the airport. They didn't leave until my plane took off. That day I was told emphatically by each police officer and security that had I fallen, I would have been killed. Women were injured that day, women who you may never hear about. You will never know their names. They didn't get to hop on a plane and leave. They have to stay and live in a country that has told them that their lives are not worth protecting. So, let me just describe to you a couple of other accounts of what happened at this event in New Zealand. Here's an account of what happened to a woman and her 10-year-old daughter who attended the protest. And for understandable reasons, she's anonymous. "My 10-year-old daughter and I attended this, and it was the angriest environment I've ever been in. We carried no signs and were standing talking to a woman we had just met well away from the rotunda, when a man pushed me and started shouting and swearing at me, and then pulled his t-shirt up and started fingering his nipples, yelling, 'Aren't these breasts?' We tried to walk away, and a group of 30-plus just followed and were yelling at us. We ended in a huddle against a tree, surrounded by angry, shouting people with megaphones who pushed us around and yelled at us. Of the 5 women, 1 man, and a 10-year-old child, none of us had signs. We weren't shouting slogans or anything else. No one asked our opinions. They just decided we had a different point of view and were aggressive and violent. The man who shoved his nipples at us saw me look at the toilets, and so he ran in the women's toilets and was giving me the finger. It was an absolute realization that... Okay, I was going to be made to allow men in the toilet with my daughter and I. Watching these angry people screaming about their rights while pushing and shoving women and children, and on 2 separate occasions, I watched large groups of people chasing old, gray-haired, terrified-looking little old ladies down the road. The signs seem to be all about human rights, but that isn't what this was about. Punching a little old gray-haired woman should never ever be okay, whether you agree with her or not. This is like some bad protest that you watch on YouTube in another country. When did New Zealand become a place that has people clap when an old lady is punched in the face? Or a 6-foot-plus man pushes a small child down so he can, I assume she's referring to her own child there, so he can yell at an old lady. If I didn't have an opinion before, I do now. All women, should be allowed to feel safe. Today was a disgusting display of bullying and violence against women. Straight women, gay women, teenagers, and female children were all physically and verbally assaulted today. It was mind-boggling. Another woman commenting on the events and responding to her said, "They did the same thing to us in Melbourne. The trans activists were screaming rape threats at women, throwing bottles, assaulting police, and punching horses. I have never seen so many police, well over 100, but they still could not hold them back. They came there for blood." So, let's take a step back for a moment and look at the overall context here. Women's and girls' right to single-sex spaces where they can have privacy and relatively greater safety from men. Not that that's any guarantee, but at least the standard is there. Those spaces are under threat, and many women, as you saw in that poll, 96% of women do not want to give up these spaces. And there's also, again, not going to get into it in detail in the interest of time, but there's also a great deal of concern about so-called gender-affirming care, where the alleged treatment for whatever dysphoria the person has about their own body on account of it being a different sex from what they imagine they should be. That those treatments are harmful and certainly should not be engaged in with children who are under the age of consent. And whatever you think about those points of view, they're not saying that they hate trans people. Just ask people who have this view, think of what they think about trans people, and they will say, well, if someone is unhappy or they're suffering psychological distress, that's unfortunate, and they should receive some sort of treatment from a competent professional to address whatever psychological issues they have. And there are many psychological issues that a large portion, the majority of people who seek transition, gender-affirming care, so to speak, in childhood, they have a plethora of psychological issues in most cases that, in addition to a gender dysphoria, which is a diagnosable mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, typically there's depression, anxiety disorders, and perhaps other stuff going on as well. And the concern is that those issues are not being adequately addressed, and instead a health damaging and sterilizing procedure is being undertaken with these children without addressing their other needs. But in any case, the question here is, should people be physically assaulted and called names and harassed and yelled and screamed at and so on and so forth on account of holding this sort of viewpoint. It's ridiculous. And just to give you an idea of the general climate around this issue, you may have heard, as I mentioned earlier, people who hold a gender-critical point of view are often referred to as TERFs, trans-exclusive radical feminists, but often the person who calls somebody this is not saying you are a trans-exclusive radical feminist, but rather they are saying it as a slur, as saying that person is a filthy subhuman thing. And somebody has compiled a collection of tweets about in which women, it's almost always women who are called this, are called TERFs, and what else the people who are calling them this have to say. TERFs can choke on my girl dick. I punch TERFs. Dead TERFs. Die cis scum with a baseball bat. The Deputy Prime Minister of Spain recently signed a Socialist Party statement in favor of protecting women's sex-based rights and criticized the impact of male self-identification into women's spaces. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but in quite a few places, there have been laws passed that say that someone can simply claim to be the opposite sex. So, a man can claim to be a woman, or a woman can claim to be a man, and not get hormones or surgery or anything. And we're supposed to just take their word for it that they're not what they were born as. An effigy of this Deputy Prime Minister's corpse was later hung from a tree. If you're a TERF, you can get fucked with a business end of a barbed wire wrapped baseball bat. Any trans allies at Pride London right now need to step the fuck up and take out the TERF trash. Get there in their faces and make them afraid. Debate never works, so fuck them up. Hey, TERFs, suck my fucking tranny dick. Anyways, stab a TERF today. Remember to twist the knife and then remove it. Just to clarify, and I cannot stress this enough, no TERF deserves teeth. Punch any you see as hard as you can. I say this because talking to them absolutely will not work. Who knew it would be about tampons? I'd stab a TERF in the crotch and give them a reason to need a tampon. TERFs should die. Literally kill all TERFs. I'm not into mass murder, but I'll commit TERF genocide if I have to. TERFs need to be eliminated off the face of the earth. And so on. Just the other day, and I'm by no means saying that the majority of people who hold this ideology have violent inclinations. Not at all. But as you presumably have heard, just the other day in Tennessee, a trans-identifying female, a woman who said she was male, used male pronouns and so forth, engaged in a mass shooting at a school that she had she had previously attended in Nashville, Tennessee, killing 3 children and 3 adults. And motivation was, or appears to be, I guess they haven't released the manifesto of this person yet, but appears to have been around this issue in some way. So So there's lots of threats of violence. People who've been attending these rallies have said that they're constantly, or who have spoken at them especially, have said they're constantly receiving rape and death threats. Dehumanizing language is commonplace, such as turf, or the C word or the B word or what have you. And people are losing their jobs over this too, for speaking out about this issue. So actually, a friend of mine, somebody I know from an online socialist discussion group I'm in, was recently, about a year ago, fired from her job for asserting basically that abortion bans harm women. On May 11, 2022, Anne Monash, a longtime civil rights attorney, lesbian, feminist, and left-wing activist, was fired from her job of 20 years, without warning, within a few days of sending an email to staff that abortion bans harm women as a sex, despite a strong work record advocating for her clients. Was her employer a far-right Christian fundamentalist opponent of abortion rights? Did she violate a directive to not discuss these matters at work? No and no. Anne's former employer, Disability Rights California, is a liberal, nonprofit, government-funded, do-good civil rights agency that has recently adopted a set of beliefs promoted by the extremist wing of transgender activists and their supporters. This is a group of people, transgender activists, who are just a subset, and certainly a small minority, of people who are transgender or their allies. Most transgender people are not people who are engaging in these acts of harassment and violence and so forth. DRC demanded that its staff adopt these beliefs as well. These controversial beliefs, rejected by many in the LGBT community itself, contend that biological sex, along with sexual orientation, do not exist as coherent categories, or to the extent sex exists at all, it must be overridden in all instances by gender identity. Lesbians become same-gender rather than same-sex attracted, with biological males included in their dating pool. And anyone with any common sense knows that attraction is based. It's attraction to a sex, typically the opposite sex, but sometimes the same sex. It's not about gender. Abortion is no longer about a woman's right to control her reproductive capacity, but the right of, quote, all genders to have access to generic, quote unquote, health care. There's no word left to describe female humans, and if they are to be referred to at all, is as a collection of body parts, such as people with uteruses or cervix havers. Anyone who disagrees with any of this is to be labeled as a hater, bigot, and TERF, an epithet used against women often combined with threats of violence, and itself a myth, since feminists welcome females who identify as transgender or non-binary and only exclude males from female-only spaces, and whose words and very existence are perceived as quote-unquote dangerous to the lives and well-being of transgender-identified persons. Thus, in the name of, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those, quote, violent and, quote, hateful staff who engage in the thought crime of refusing to deny the existence and continued importance of biological sex, even concerning something as essential to women's status as abortion rights, must be excluded from the workplace. In other words, fired for telling the truth. Neither was Anne's email contravening any policy. The executive director himself brought up the subject of the imminent reversal of Roe versus Wade, this was in May last year, himself by announcing on the all-staff email list that DRC had issued a public statement supporting abortion rights. And if anybody is listening to this who doesn't know, Roe versus Wade is the Supreme Court decision in 1973 that made abortion legal in the United States, and it was repealed in June of last year by the Supreme Court. The executive director himself brought up the subject of the imminent reversal of Roe versus Wade by announcing on the all-staff email list that DRC had issued a public statement supporting abortion rights. He explicitly welcomed staff feedback regarding the statement. DRC's statement provided a laundry list of who could be negatively impacted by an abortion ban, but women or females were not mentioned. Anne responded as follows: "So glad DRC came up with a statement in defense of Roe. Thank you. Access to safe, legal abortion is a life and death necessity for women as a biological sex across the board, regardless of race, economic class, gender identity, sexual orientation, even lesbians can be raped, or anything else, and an absolute prerequisite for equal female participation in our society." Of course, the most vulnerable females, especially poor women, etc., 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 will suffer the most under draconian anti-abortion laws. Wealthy white women have often managed to get abortions even before Roe. As a veteran of the feminist struggle for abortion rights that preceded Roe, I never thought it would come to this. Yet it is good to remember that women won this right primarily through grassroots organizing and peaceful mass protests in the streets, and that is the way we are going to protect it. Thanks again, DRC, for taking a stand. Immediately, all hell broke loose. A staff member called Anne a hate monger and a TERF. She argues that trans people are not who we say we are. This is a dangerous, deceitful lie and results in serious violence and stigma against trans people. Trans men and non-binary people also need abortions. This staff member had been investigating Anne's outside feminist political activities on the internet and cited statements made in her role as leader of Feminists in Struggle that the member claimed were further evidence of her anti-transgender politics. Anne clarified that she was talking about sex, not gender, in her email on abortion, but to no avail. That was on a Friday. By the following Monday, Anne's work team had met behind her back and had issued a statement condemning her for her opinions as being against the values of her team. Anne responded by accusing DRC of homophobia, harassment, and bullying in the manner of a witch hunt. 2 days later, she received a text on her cell phone stating that she was fired. Reason given? Ongoing performance issues, which there were none. She had outstanding evaluations of her work. Anne's case should be deeply concerning to lesbians, feminists, supporters of workers' rights, and anyone else who believes that employers should not have the right to control the thoughts, opinions, and outside political activities of employees. No democracy can survive if employees are terrified on pain of losing their jobs of participating in political activity outside of work, of which their employer may disapprove. And, I've talked about this before, that there have been a number of cases on various issues where people have lost jobs or otherwise been discriminated against in terms of employment or suffered from a hostile work environment because of their political views. So, for instance, a fellow who had landed a job at my graduate school alma mater, University of Illinois, was subsequently, they just fired him before he even started a job because of his, criticism of the Israeli government and backing for Palestinians' rights. And there are many, many cases of people being fired for their opinions on this issue. So even tenured professors have lost their jobs. I hope we can all agree that we ought to live in a society where people can feel free to express their opinions about political issues, as long as they're not saying I love Nazis or something like that. Just political opinions within the spectrum of rational or mainstream thought, such as the opinion that there should be single-sex bathrooms, which, as I mentioned, the poll in the UK found 96% of women supported that. You shouldn't be yelled at, shouted down, called names, physically assaulted, threatened, etc., just because you hold such views that other people may not agree with. And the Let Women Speak movement that Kelly J. Keene started has, especially given the fact that they weren't even allowed to speak at all in New Zealand before they were, confronted by a vicious mob, and some of them were physically assaulted. That you know, and she's making the point. Well, look, women are not being allowed to speak. People are trying to stop them from speaking. They're trying to silence women um, merely because they have an opinion that these activists do not agree with. Um, and I would submit to you that generally speaking, the opinions they are presented are ones that the majority of people do agree with. Um, but a lot of people are scared to speak their mind about this issue. For instance, although I've recently been pretty vocal about it on social media, this is the first time I've talked about it on this channel um, because it has become a third rail, so to speak, that people are afraid to talk about, and you know we've got to be able to talk about issues that you know have these deleterious impacts on people. Um, so anyway, I just wanted to uh, share accounts of those incidents with you, and talk about the issues that um, this conflict involves. And I do want to reemphasize that I, like the women who spoke in Australia and attempted to speak in New Zealand and have spoken up elsewhere, I'm of the opinion that you know uh, there should be single sex spaces. There should be, at the very least, extreme caution before undertaking drastic measures like puberty blockers or hormones or surgery for people who say they're not happy with the sex that they are. And people should be able to talk about it. Um, and at the same time, of course, people who identify as trans, so they're male and they say they wish they were, or say they are a woman, or they're female and they say they wish they were a man, or they are a man, or a boy, or what have you. Um, you know, uh, People shouldn't be discriminated against for having that view and having that dysphoria. They shouldn't be discriminated against in terms of employment or housing or anything else. So there is such a thing as trans rights, and those are the same rights that we uh, would like to see protected for everyone. But when things escalate to the point where not only those sorts of rights, but the quote unquote right to, for example, um, invade enter a women's locker room when you're a male, like Leah Thomas, the swimmer, did at the NCAA swimming championships a couple of years ago. Um, that crosses over into violating other people's rights, namely women's and girls' rights, or even speaking as a man and not having to worry about the safety of allowing women into spaces where I am, such as a locker room. I still, like most men, prefer privacy. You know, I don't want women in a locker room with me. That doesn't mean I have anything against women. I'm in a 10-year relationship with one. But you know, people like to have spaces where their privacy and dignity are respected. In the case of women, measures need to be taken to try to, as best we can, to keep them safe, and holding the opinion that these are valid concerns. Doesn't make anyone a bigot or turf, so to speak, or whatever. So I think that these events will continue, and you know, hopefully we'll get to a place where people can talk about this issue without anyone screaming at them or insulting them or threatening them or whatnot. Wouldn't that be a good world to be in, where women and men equally had the right to speak?